You are listening to C-Suite Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to C-Suite Perspectives, a signature series by the Conference Board. I'm Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board and the host of this podcast series. And in today's discussion, we're going to discuss the upcoming U.S. presidential election and where the two candidates stand on their views on trade and how these positions could impact our economy and business. Joining me today is Susan Schwab, the former U.S. trade rep in the second half of the Bush administration and a strategic advisor on public policy and trade at Mayer Brown. She's also a trustee of the Conference Board. And Susan, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Steve. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah. So, Susan, not everybody who is listening knows exactly all the technical terms and everything, but just maybe we can start with just what do you mean by trade policy when we're speaking at the federal level, and how does this work?
So when I used to teach at the University of Maryland and occasionally still guest lecture, I would describe trade policy as sort of this confluence of foreign policy, international economic policy, domestic politics, and domestic economic policy, sort of the intersection of those four. And depending on the era, depending on the time, some of those impacts, some of those influences would be more prominent than others. So for example, right now, obviously foreign policy and domestic economic policy, domestic politics are far more influential than international economic policy.
Yeah, so that, but there is an intersection here of trade policy and, the whole, everything that the Department of State does, which is, foreign policy, economic policy, foreign relations, defense. I mean, it's sort of sitting at the nexus here.
Well, that's right. And it has morphed into a much broader, over time, it's morphed out into a much broader space. So if you think about when trade policy started, it was sort of tariff policy. And tariff policy was tax policy. And that was about it. And then you started getting trade agreements. But then your trade agreements went beyond the movement of goods across borders and started including services. And you went beyond tariffs and you started including non-tariff barriers. Well, at that point, you're getting into the space of regulators, you're getting into the space of subsidies, you're getting into industrial policy. And so when you look, if you want a sense of how much of an intersection, as you say, trade policy is today, you look at the interagency process that develops U.S. trade policy, comes up through interagency trade policy or process that the Office of the USTR generally leads up through the White House. In this administration, the National Security Council is more prominent, but there are 20 plus agencies that are a part of that. And that includes the State Department, includes DOD, it includes the Department of Energy, it includes obviously Department of Agriculture, Commerce, Treasury, some of the core agencies you'd expect, but it also includes a lot of agencies that you'd be surprised to see there because of the breadth of the issues involved.
Yeah, and the with this integrated global supply chain and, the world has gotten smaller. If you think about what makes up our GDP, 70% is the consumer. You've got all of that being interacting with trade in some fashion, whether it's, supply chain in, out, and, exports. Our entire economy, revolves around this. So this is so important. And, we've seen wars started over, trade disputes in history. So it's really, really important that people understand what these candidates stand for, where we're going on trade policy, because it just touches so much of what we do.
Exactly. And we also need to understand that even though our politicians tend to talk the most about trade in manufactured goods, trade in agriculture, and above all, trade in services, including, cross-border digital data flows, are also part of that trade equation, as well as foreign direct investment, outbound investment, inward investment. So, we may think of it, or our politicians may talk about it as the movement of one widget across the border. It's a whole lot more complicated than that. Exactly.
Yeah, and all the IP interactions with that as well, which I know we're going to talk about.
Yep. Exactly.
Okay, so let's just get into it. We've got two candidates, Harris and Trump. One of them has talked more about trade policy than the other, but the others promise more of a continuation of the current administration. So just kind of lay out an overview of the similarities and differences between the two.
So let me start. I'm going to start with a disclaimer, which is I'm not involved in either campaign, so I can't claim to have any inside knowledge of either one. I'm sort of looking from the outside, and they both look pretty similar. They both have a heavy focus on tariffs, heavy focus on the use of sticks rather than carrots when it comes to trying to change the behavior of trading partners. Both focus heavily on China, not surprising. Neither seem to be focused on trade agreements. Neither seem to be particularly enthusiastic about trade organizations. And even though the talk about tariffs as leverage, we haven't seen evidence of tariffs being used as leverage. Tariffs have gone up and then they stay up. They went up during the Trump administration and they stayed up or went up further during the Biden administration. And they don't seem to be used as leverage, and they don't seem to be changing anybody's behavior. So I think those are worth noting. The only other things that I can think of that I would say are slight differences. One, the Biden administration, and so one would presume the Harris administration, is more focused on the industrial policy side, meeting competition by influencing winners and losers in our economy. And the Trump team, and the former president in particular, is very focused on bilateral trade deficits as opposed to the broader global trade deficit. I would say the other thing, closing out, that they have in common is that both seem to look for trade solutions, or seem to be looking for trade solutions to non-trade problems.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I want to come back to that in a minute. But you use this expression of tariffs, and I think everybody thinks they know what a tariff is, but it's really a tax on imports, right?
That's right, exactly. It's a tax that you collect at the border, at the border.
And where does that money go?
That money goes into the Treasury.
Okay.
It is generally paid for by the importer and ultimately passed along to the consumer. And the consumer, by the way, can be me walking into Walmart, or the consumer can be a beer keg manufacturer who's importing steel and has to pay an extra tariff on the imported steel.
But this is an interesting point, because this is revenue to the federal government, which, there's a dearth of, and so it's a tax. But that tax then gets passed through, doesn't show up on your income taxes, so it doesn't look like you're paying more, but it gets passed through all the way to pricing, or whether it's a B2B pricing or a B2C pricing, business to consumer. Ultimately, it's borne out in the end product, right? So it's essentially no different than taking that money directly out of consumers' pockets and putting it in the federal treasury.
That is correct. With a couple of things worth noting. One, it's very regressive. I mean, as a tax, it's a highly regressive tax.
Meaning it hits those least. It's a bigger proportion of
exactly the people who can least afford it are going to be paying the most, and so that's worth noting. And the other thing worth noting is that it doesn't necessarily raise huge amounts of revenue, but if you, as some politicians are talking about, using it to offset tax reductions in the 2025 tax law rewrite. We have a tax bill that is going to expire in 2025. It has to be renewed or renegotiated or expire. But regardless, they're going to have to be pay-fors. Usually the pay-fors come in the form of, well, you either reduce the revenues by reducing by either increasing taxes or reducing the tax breaks, or you come up with some other means of raising money. And there are political figures on both the Republican and the Democratic side on the Hill who are saying, well, let's just raise tariffs and we'll use that to plug some of the holes. To me, that's very, very short-sighted, because it is a tax. It hits the poorest and least able to afford it. And it eliminates the possibility of using tariffs as a trade policy tool.
Well, that's an important point, because typically tariffs have been thought of in conjunction with really geopolitical strategy and trying to get conformance of behavior of trading partners to WTO and other rule sets. In this case, it's nominally that, but it is also being used as fiscal policy.
Yeah, but you can't do both, right? Exactly. The point you're making, if you cannot claim that you're raising tariffs as leverage to change the other country's behavior if you're not going to be in a position to lower those tariffs. And if you're using those tariffs to generate revenue to offset other tax cuts, you can't reduce those tariffs then. And you got to
without blowing a hole in the budget.
Without blowing a hole in the budget, and you've got to go back to Congress. There's also a procedural issue here, which is one of the more fun, arcane, complicated things about making trade policy, because under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, it is technically the Congress of the United States that has that responsibility. But over the centuries, a lot of it, over many decades, at least since let's say 1934, all right, a lot of it's been delegated to the executive branch. So you're not going to have 535 members of Congress negotiating a trade agreement. So they will periodically delegate trade negotiating and implementing authority to the president. They will, however, and they have over the years, put on the books tariff raising or other import blocking authorities, and those are permanent, that the president, the executive branch, can use. And we've seen that. We saw that in the Trump administration. When President Trump raised tariffs, he didn't have to go back to Congress to ask. But if he wanted to lower tariffs, other than the ones that he raised by his own executive authority, he would have to get an act of Congress to lower those tariffs, such as you could not use tariffs that were put up to generate tax revenue as a trade policy tool, because you couldn't reduce it without an act of Congress.
Okay, so what started in the constitutionally as the duty of Congress has now evolved or devolved, depending on your view, to the executive branch, which gives them great latitude to implement their trade policy, including tariffs. Now, tariffs...
It gives them great latitude to implement barriers to trade. It does not give them authorities to reduce barriers to trade, or to reach trade agreements, or to implement trade agreements. That authority, Congress has continued to guard, and only gives to the president, only gives to the executive branch from time to time, and only in limited periods of time with strings attached. So the president it's much easier for president to be protectionist than it is for a president to negotiate trade agreements. I guess that's the short version.
But your role, in the Bush administration as a U.S. trade rep, working with other cabinet members, was to execute these things and to bring it forward. Congress's role has become ratification, is what you're saying.
Well, we did all of the above. The beginning of the Bush 43 administration, the administration went to the Congress and asked for authority to conclude and implement trade agreements, and that include trade liberalizing agreements. The trade agreements that I negotiated as USTR, that subsequently went up to the Congress for a yes or no vote, up or down vote, no amendments, that was pursuant to authority that the Congress had given to the Bush administration early on. However, when we were retaliating against an unfair trade practice of the Chinese, or an unfair trade practice by Canada or the EU or somebody else, we had all the authority we needed to do that without going back to the Congress, because that authority is on the books.
We're talking about the trade policies that have been proposed by the two major presidential candidates. We're going to take a short break and be right back.
What does the future of work mean for your employees? How will your company navigate ESG? Will there be a global recession? At the Conference Board, our experts translate the latest research and economic analysis into insights and real-time problem solving for your organization. Membership at the Conference Board provides your team with an assortment of knowledge, from economics, marketing and communications, ESG, public policy, and human capital. As a member, you'll have access to our center experts, member-exclusive events, data and benchmarking tools, and peer sharing that will help you understand the present and shape the future. Consider becoming a Conference Board member today by visiting www.conference-board.org.
Welcome back to C-Suite Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland from the Conference Board, and I'm joined today by Susan Schwab, the former U.S. Trade Representative in the Bush administration and currently Strategic Advisor on Public Policy and Trade at Mayor Brown. So, Susan, just help me with this. Why are we weaponizing trade? I thought trade was a good thing, but people are thinking of it as a bad thing now. Help.
You are absolutely right, and it is a distressing development for those of us who are, call it classical economists or business people. A lot of it, unfortunately, has to do with China, and it's hard to summarize the U.S.-China or China global trade challenges that sort of have gotten us where we are. But it has to do really with the fact that you've got this very, very large economy that has economies of scale that make it competitive, that was a developing country that is still developing in certain respects, but not so much anymore as it used to in terms of, say, low wage competition. And that the magnitude and the velocity of exports from China has overwhelmed developing and developed countries alike and has created a backlash. Now, one could argue that a lot of that is sort of natural competitive factors at work, right? Some comparative advantage, the size and scale of the Chinese economy, and now there are Chinese innovations and technological developments that are very much their own. However, the problem comes not so much with that, and that we've sort of the political challenge there can be encompassed in the discussion about the quote China shock, and there have been some good academic papers associated with that, where you had this massive influx of manufactured goods coming into the U.S. in a concentrated period of time in the 90s through the 2000, let's say 2011 or so, displacing workers, displacing communities faster than those communities and those individuals could adjust. And we've dealt with masses of imports coming in before. We dealt with the Asian tigers with export-led growth policies, but it was not of this magnitude. So that's bucket one. There are three buckets here. The second bucket is what begins to explain the politics even more. And that is call it the artificial or government influenced competitiveness issue. And here you get Chinese industrial policies that include massive subsidies at various levels of government, resulting in overcapacity, resulting in the dumping and subsidization of exports all over the world, and very artificially low pricing, let's say that impacts companies, non-Chinese companies trying to do business in China, impacts those companies when the Chinese competition shows up in their home market, or when you're trying to compete with Chinese exporters in a third country market, say a US company versus Chinese companies in Mexico, in Morocco, in the EU, and so on. So those sets of issues, plus things like cyber hacking, intellectual property theft, some of those issues where the Chinese government has worked very closely with Chinese businesses, and it's very hard to differentiate between Chinese business and government, to tip the scale. So that's sort of the second bucket, and that has contributed to the unhappiness, the anger, the suspicion, the perception that what the Chinese government is doing is predatory. And then the last bucket, we go back to our initial conversation, the last bucket has to do with national security and national security policy. So even when the US was concerned about US Japan trade, Japan was an ally. In this case, you have the Chinese government that has its civil military fusion policy where you can't differentiate between the private sector and the military sector in R&D. You have the Chinese government actively supporting the Russians in their aggressive advance into Ukraine and so on and so forth. So here you've got competitive and commercial issues and challenges coming from a country that does not appear friendly. So that's sort of a long-winded way
Yeah.
of describing a really complicated situation, because I should note there are US companies that are doing very well in China.
Yeah. And this is the challenge, Susan, because so you came, we were allies in World War II. We came out of that period. They took taken over by the communists. It basically everything shut down. Then they opened it back up. And over the last 30, 40 years, they've become everybody's manufacturing partner because they had very cheap labor and a lot of it, and they needed to do something with it. And it has evolved on their part. It's been so successful. They've become wealthier, and it's evolved to a new strategy, which is more geopolitical, which is that they want to assume their rightful spot as in their mind as the world's #1 economy, currently #2 behind the U.S. And they really want the respect of being the leading geopolitical player. So they're not quite there, but we've gone from being business partners to being frenemies, which is friends on the business side, but almost enemies on the geopolitical side as they try to dominate the South China Sea and these other things. And so your description of this, I think, is very apt, which is it's this combination of two factors which come to play, which typically, you don't see in trade negotiations, which are typically between allies.
And the other thing is, it has become harder and harder for US businesses, in many cases, to do business in China. So what had been a welcoming market for many companies is a lot less welcoming.
More difficult, and they keep stealing all our stuff because they're trying to get a leg up and catch up on everything. Which means instead of inventing their own IP, they're just taking ours. So that this has created a lot of tension all the way around. But we have to also say that the business community does a lot of the U.S. business community does a lot of business in China, and they still rely on China to manufacture and import into this country, and that has raised a ton of people out of poverty. It has helped to, in this country as well, it's helped to raise the standard of living significantly as the cost of goods have come down. So as these two candidates are talking about tariffs, and especially targeted at China, that could have a big impact, negative impact on, reverse everything that's been done here, negative impact on, the status of our living standards.
No, that is absolutely right. And a lot, we talk about there are hundreds of billions of dollars in US China trade that have nothing whatsoever to do with national security or commercially sensitive products and sectors. And that's goods and services. And we tend to forget that. We also tend to forget that there are companies that import from China that help make them and the US more globally competitive. And there's a balance that one has to strike here. And it's the scalpel rather than the hammer that you want as your trade policy. And sometimes, the sort of throw a tariff at it can look more hammer-like than scalpel-like.
And the Biden administration largely continued the tariffs started in the Trump administration. You would, by corollary, Harris is promising to carry that forward. Trump, though, is promising that and a lot more, because he's also promised across the board tariffs beyond China on all imported goods. Talk about that and the potential implications.
That one sort of befuddles me, to be honest. It has a negative impact on, as we said, US users and consumers.
Price of goods.
The price of goods, exactly. It will, by definition, generate retaliation against US exports, meaning it's not like our trading partners are going to sit there and go, oh, gee whiz, we're now facing a 10% or 20% or 60% tariff on our exports to the US. They're going to say, well, okay, fine, we're going to put up a trade barrier against your exports to us. And the way retaliation tends to work, by the way, is they don't necessarily retaliate against the same product that you put the tariffs up. They retaliate against products where you're competitive and you really want to get into their market. So the folks who are, quote, protected in the US aren't the ones who pay the price. The ones who pay the price are the ones who either consume or who are trying to export or are successful exporters to the markets that are retaliating. So that's the other side of the equation. It ends up costing everybody.
Yeah, and this Trump's position is not a traditional Republican Party position. This is really unique to him, and it's protectionist in the sense that he's nominally trying to protect American jobs, but in so doing, he's going to make everybody. This would make everybody poorer along the way because everything's more expensive. You can't consume as much. Everything's poor. The GDP is negatively impacted. I mean, it seems like it would put us into a death spiral from an economic standpoint that is really would be a self-inflicted wound.
Well, I think it hurts economically. I am even more concerned about the commercial diplomacy aspect of it, the national security and commercial diplomacy aspect of it. Because if you really are concerned about China, or you're really concerned about the axis of evil or the axis of autocracies, right? Then you need to be making friends and influencing people outside the United States. You need to have allies that are with you.
And yeah, like NATO and Europe and the EU.
That's right. The EU, also developing countries. I mean, Indonesia, Brazil, Malaysia, Vietnam. I mean, countries that want to be on your side, that would like to be closer to us and perhaps less close to China. And that kind of thing just drives them into the arms of China. That plus not doing trade agreements like TPP. I mean, it's sort of a no-brainer, but apparently it's just not going to happen.
Yeah, and now we've got USMCA that's going to be up for renewal, and any predictions there based on one candidate versus the other?
That's a great question. USMCA has to come up for renewal in 2026. I think that it will be. It's almost by definition going to be used as leverage, or an attempt will be made to use it as leverage to get whatever you didn't get in the negotiations the last time, or you wish you'd gotten, or you should have gotten. But then the other countries are going to feel the same way. And in terms of Mexico, the situation has gotten much more complicated, and China feeds into this to the extent that you've got increases in Chinese investment south of the border, and concerns that Chinese barriers to China's imports into the United States are being circumvented by Chinese product coming in through Mexico. So that will factor into the 2026 renegotiation or renewal, regardless of the administration, I would suspect. However, in both cases, either case, they're going to have to deal with a border immigration issue as well. And you have to wonder, to what extent is a US administration going to want to blow up the trade relationship when arguably higher on their priority list should be the immigration issue on the subject.
And they've got to resolve that. So what I hear you saying,
they've got to resolve that with the Mexican government, the same Mexican government. So that will be interesting. So I suspect there'll be a lot of tension. I worry a great deal that there'll be gamesmanship, brinksmanship, and the USMCA will not get renewed in 2026. That's a really ugly scenario. That doesn't mean it goes out of business right away. It takes it into the way the USMCA agreement was set up is you can have a series of years where it's not renewed year after year after year until it's renewed, or until it goes out.
Essentially extenders in some fashion. But what I hear you saying overall is, okay, tariffs are bad overall from an economic standpoint, cost of goods, inflation, all of these kinds of things. But you can understand the geopolitical aspects of them, particularly with a player like China, who is becoming a geopolitical adversary aligned with Russia. But this whole notion of then across the board tariffs, which hit everybody, hit all of our allies and the people that we need aligned to deal with all these other issues, including Canada and Mexico and the USMCA, but also the NATO countries and countries around the world who have to deal with the stuff that's going on adversarially. And so therefore poking them in the eye is not a good idea, in addition to it being a bad economic idea. Did I get it right?
Yeah. It makes no sense whatsoever, either from an economic standpoint or from a geopolitical or national security standpoint. I would say, in terms of tariffs against China or tariffs against fill in the blank, unless you have a specific policy goal in mind, right? Unless you really are using them strategically, and I'm a firm believer in using tariffs. There are legal reasons for putting up, rules of the road through the WTO where you can legally put up tariffs against dumped and subsidized imports that injure your domestic producers. I am all for that. And I am all for taking cases to the WTO, winning them, and retaliating and using tariffs or some other form of retaliation. So I am very enthusiastic about active trade policies. But
that's to get people to behave and conform to a normative
that's
set of
right,
behavior.
and that has to do with being strategic.
Well, we'll leave it there. I think that was a really good discussion, Susan. Susan Schwab, thanks for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, and thanks to the conference board.
And thanks to all of you for listening to C-Suite Perspectives.
You have been listening to C-Suite Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.